Hello there, I've just shot a video where I've gone through my 10 essential jazz rock fusion albums, and I really wanted to pick up on the musicians that made those albums and talk about them. So this video is going to be called The Essential Jazz Rock Fusion Musicians. So who are they? Well, there's a big clue on the first album that I covered, which is this one. This one here, Bitches Brew. If we do go in and look at the, I'll just go and have a look at the lineup on the very first track on here. So this disc here is actually the complete sessions. It's a fantastic album, and it's the complete sessions from Bitches Brew. If I can just find, God, there's like a book in here, and I'm trying to find something that tells me who is on this. I should really know this, and I could probably do it mostly by heart. Right, here we go. So, in terms of sessions, the first session apparently recorded for this was Bitches Brew, John McLaughlin and Sanctuary. And that was recorded on August the 19th, 1969. And the lineup on that was Miles Davis, Wayne Shorter, Bernie Maupin, Joe Zawinul, Chick Corea, John McLaughlin, David Holland, Harvey Brooks, Lenny White, Jack DeJohnette, Don Elias, Joma Santos, and that's it. We also could add to that, I know Billy Cobham is on this album, on the later sessions. Yeah, he played on Great Expectations, Orange Lady, Yafet and Corrado. Ayeto Moria's on here, Chick Corea. Just having a quick going through. So when we start to look at this album, what's really interesting is a lot of the musicians on this seminal album are the ones who go on to make the albums that I covered. You know, John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham going on to the Mavish Orchestra, Wayne Shorter, Ayeto Morio, Joe Zawinul, going on to Weather Report, Chick Corea, Lenny White going on to Return to Forever. You know, you can really see how, in some way, jazz rock fusion is born on that Bitches Brew album. It's not the first jazz rock fusion album, but it's the one that brings all those musicians together. And perhaps the success of that album, and this is where it's probably something no one's ever said that's probably very important, is that album sold a lot of records. It sold around about 500,000 copies when it came out. I think it was picked up by the sort of hippies as the sort of next stage on after Jeff and an Airplane, and then the Grateful Dead, you know, and then after the Grateful Dead you go to Bitches Brew. I think it may have well been a bit of a sort of, you know, tune in, turn on, drop out album. You know, as people dropped acid, they would put on Bitches Brew, and I'm sure it would take you on a journey. And so because of that, it's immensely successful. It becomes part of the culture of that time. And the musicians are then able to go out and negotiate very good deals, usually with CBS Records. It's a fantastic label with high production values. And we get many of the albums that I covered here. In fact, shall we experimentally look at it? So Heavy Weather is on CBS. Chick Corea on CBS. Headhunters, yep, CBS. Mavish Orchestra, it's all CBS, I know that. This one here, I think this is one of the great fusion albums ever, but this is on Nempa Records. Nempa is a great label, but it's not CBS Records, and then this does not have the cultural significance of something like this. You know, if I go through them, Billy Cobham's on Atlantic, another fantastic label, same label as Led Zeppelin, and of course Zappa's on his own label, which I think he will be Bizarre Records, but it's Warner Brothers subsidiary. But you know, the vast majority, so 80% of those albums are on CBS Records. You know, so this is a moment where certain musicians are given a voice, and what is it about those musicians, you know, that's so important? You know, the table is set in 1970-71. Okay, the Beatles have packed it in 1970 right? But they've created this huge cultural movement. You know, pop music is no longer just pop music. It has a cultural significance. That's in the words and the meanings, but also in the sound. The 60s is a time when culture changes. It's one of the great moments in human history where humanity opens itself up to new ideas. And by opening itself up to new ideas, it lets in all ideas, whatever those ideas are. It tries them out. You know, it's not censorious. It's not a cancel type of culture. It's an open culture, right? And in doing that, it lets new voices in. And by the early 70s, in rock music, the budgets are there to not only let those voices in, but really put a push behind it. It's an incredible time culturally. And this is felt right across rock, you know, rock music and pop music. You know, so if you go onto Wikipedia and you put in the biggest albums of all time, and you know things crop up like Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. Yeah, it's an incredible achievement for an artist to create an album that sells that many records. But then when you put it on, it's a difficult piece of art. This is an incredible time. So the arena in which these musicians are coming is ready for something, but these musicians are ready themselves. This generation that Miles Davis has grabbed, and the other musicians around that, like people like Frank Zappa and Larry Coryell and Gary Burton, these are musicians that have come up with a different type of training to myself and other fusion musicians or prog musicians or rock musicians that are working today. They would have been born at a time where there was no rock music, okay? They would have come up really picking up little bits of details. You know, I know musicians of that generation. My friend Kevin Gammond, the great Kevin Gammond, who was in the Band of Joy with Robert Plant and John Bonham. He also played with the blues guitarist Jimmy Witherspoon. He was the guitarist with Jimmy Cliff in the 60s. You know, and he's a really close friend of mine. He said when he was learning in the 1950s, he'd sort of picked up the guitar, some basic classical guitar music. You know, there's no rock and roll to learn, and then rock and roll suddenly starts to come out. And he said he would hear a song on the radio, and he would pick up his guitar and try and learn that song while it was playing, because, you know, once that song was gone, it was gone. You couldn't go in the UK. You couldn't buy those records in the shop. You had to try and get them on import. You know, the reason why the Beatles happened is because they were in Liverpool. And Liverpool, they had the boats pulling in with all these records. You know, the sailors would arrive with all these rhythm and blues records. You know, the information was sparse. So, you know, musicians like John McLaughlin and Chick Corea, they're picking up stuff from, I think, 3 areas. One is the basic classical tradition by which all musicians back then, and many now, are trained. But most musicians back then, if they picked up a guitar or a piano, they're not going to be emulating Nirvana songs. All they've got is the sort of classical model of learning, you know, so basic reading skills, learning, you know, say simple tunes, and then moving on to more complex classical tunes. They would also have the folk forms that are around them at that time, you know. So someone like Chick Corea has got these sort of, you know, Latin American and Spanish music, you know. I think he's of Mexican heritage, if I got that right. So that's where he's coming from, you know. So on Billy Cobham, he's born in Panama, and he's again growing up with Latin American music, you know, but he's sort of percussion music. John McLaughlin's growing up with sort of flamenco, classical, blues, and then later jazz, you know, but and Indian music as well. He's heard Indian music at a very early age, but flamenco is very important to him. All these influences, these other folk influences, almost provide the colour of each of the great bands and albums created by these musicians. That's something that's really interesting to me. That this fusion music isn't just a fusion music between jazz and rock. It's a fusion music between jazz and all sorts of things. This had always happened in jazz, but it becomes so intense with fusion. The fusion's a good name for the genre because there's all sorts of different music. You know, if you listen to bands like Oregon, for example, who are sort of a very American folk classical fusion with jazz. They are a fusion band, you know, and there's elements of rock music and pop music in that band as well. So this is one of the points I want to make. Those musicians are not just fusing jazz and rock. They're fusing all sorts of things. But the rock thing is actually happening almost in their adult life. But when they're very young, you know, at that formative point in their sort of life as a musician, you know, that first 10 years, if you start playing an instrument in your sort of childhood and you come up through your teen years, but for these musicians, say if you Chick Corea, for example, who's born in 1941, rock and roll's coming out in 1955, well, you're a teenager by that point. You're like 14 years old. But rock music's not really fully emerging until about 1964, and it's burgeoning up until around about 1967, 68. Well, by 68, Chick Corea's on the scene. He's got a deal. You know, at 64, he's like in his early 20s. So they're taking this rock influence in. That's part of the culture of the 1960s. It's part of this culture of being open. Right, so Miles Davis is important because Miles Davis is not from that. Miles Davis is really from the Charlie Parker era jazz. He's a jazz artist, right? And he wants to create new forms. And one of the ways he creates new forms is to bring highly skilled musicians. And he's done this for his whole career. He brings in highly skilled musicians and then he puts them in a context where they're almost like confused, that there's some sort of cognitive dissonance in what he's asked them to do, which almost accesses a sort of unconscious part of them, and it expresses themselves through it using their virtuosity, but not the slave of their virtuosity. I think he did this for so many musicians, and he created so many new forms. And the way you do this is with young musicians. It's really interesting to look at the way Miles Davis is changed by Tony Williams when Tony Williams joins the group. Now, when Tony and Herbie Hancock to some extent joined his group in the early 60s, they're very young. But there's no rock and roll music influences to come in at that point. You know, in 1963, 64, you know, they might be listening to the Beatles, but that's only just happened. But Miles takes the youthfulness, especially someone like Tony Williams, and he allows that to come into the music. I was watching an interview with Dennis Chambers this morning with the great Greg Bendian from the Mahavishnu Project, and he said something very interesting. He said, Dennis Chambers said he saw the Tony Williams with Miles Davis in 1967, and he said it was almost like the Tony Williams band with Miles Davis guesting. You know, Miles was allowing Tony to do whatever he wanted. And he said when Dennis played for John McGoughlin, it was the same thing. He says John McGoughlin, he said you cannot play enough drums for John McGoughlin. You know, that if Dennis start to speed tracks up, rather than John McGoughlin turn around and saying, no, Dennis, you're playing it too fast, he would scratch his head and go, right, I'm going to have to work out a new way of playing it if we're playing at this speed. This is an incredible thing. I've played in bands all my life, and as a drummer, we all know that we're supposed to play for the song. What makes a good drummer? Drummer plays for the song, you know. I would like to do a video on this concept of playing for the song, right? Because it's true, and you have to do it. But sometimes that can lead to very cliched stuff. You know, some of the greatest things that's happening in music is where the musicians have been allowed to express themselves. And this is precisely what John McGoughlin does for the musicians in his band. He got this from Miles Davis. It's precisely what Miles did with his musicians. So these new musicians who are trained jazz musicians, but trained in the tradition of jazz. You know, many of these musicians, you know, take someone like John McGoughlin, they never went to jazz college. They didn't go to Berkeley and learn how to play jazz. He's learnt this by listening himself. He's listened to the records. But he's become a virtuoso jazz musician because he's learnt something listening to those records. It's a thing that was very important in jazz, which I think has gone. It's the idea that if you copy someone, that's bad. Right? If you turn around and someone is copying your licks, you can call them out. you're playing my licks. Why are you playing my licks? Go and find your own licks. And so musicians at that time, right, the virtuosity, it's part of the virtuosity is that you've got to find your own way of sounding, your own way of playing, right? So this is the melting pot into which these musicians come. You know, people like Miles Davis take these musicians on, right? Allow them to bring their stuff in because he hasn't got a filter. And their openness to trying to create a new sound, which of course some of them, the really creative ones, are going to look around and say, well, this is new rock music coming out. Maybe I take some of that. You know, so in the last video, I mentioned Larry Coryell and Gary Burton. I think they're very important, along with John McLaughlin, you know, in the development of jazz rock fusion as a style. You know, these guys can play jazz. They know what they're doing. They, you know, Larry Coryell's listened to his Wes Montgomery's come through that. Gary Burton is you know, at a very young age, 17, 18, is a fully formed virtuoso jazz musician. But they're emerging at a time when you've got the Beatles, you know, and then in America you've got Jefferson Airplane, you've got then the Grateful Dead are coming in, and then you've got your Rolling Stones coming in. You've got Love, you've got like Mike Bloomfield, you know, you've got Cream. All these things are happening at that time, you know, and you feel morally obliged to create your own sound. Well, you're going to go through that, right? Now, I think what happened with jazz rock fusion, which I think is the message of this video, the interesting thing, is many musicians were doing it at that time. Musicians were doing it in the UK, you know. Rock music, I think, is really formed in the UK in the 1960s. I've said this so many times. Here in the UK, we had a very rich cultural scene in the 60s going on in London with blues musicians, jazz musicians, you know, folk musicians, rock and roll musicians, musicians that come up through skiffle, musicians that come up through trad jazz. They're all mixing together and they're all milling around, and then they're creating new forms of music, you know. John McLaughlin's involved in this, but it also, you've got musicians like, you know, Jimmy Page, you know, you've got Hendrix, you've got like Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce, Eric Clapton. They're fusing absolutely everything, and they create this thing which I call rock music. Rock music's different to rock and roll, rhythm and blues. Rock music, I really believe, starts with Cream, and it has that possibility to expand. It's a creative form that can expand. And John McLaughlin's part of that scene. So this makes Bitches Brew even the more important, because for some reason Miles is not only being able to draft in the musicians that are around in America, pulling on that burgeoning rock music scene, but he's also be able to tap in to what is going on in the UK. You know, so someone like Chick Corea, you know, in the late 60s, in interviews, he is explaining his admiration for Cream, especially the last album with the big live, you know, disc on it. You can hear a new way of improvising. This is Chick Corea. You can hear that. But on Bitches Brew, you've actually got a musician that's been a part of that scene. It's absolutely bizarre that, you know, not only is John McLaughlin pulled into that from London, right, but on that album, there's a track called John McLaughlin. So Miles is aware of what John's bringing to it. Now, what people say is that, you know, well, John was bringing to it the electric guitar, but he'd used George Benson on an album before. There's a track, I think, called Paraphernalia off Miles in the Sky that Benson had played on. But John McLaughlin doesn't just bring the guitar, he brings in what was going on in London at the time. Remember Hendrix? Hendrix couldn't do it in the States. Hendrix had to go to London to do that. He had to go into that scene. And then that scene comes back out and it goes back into the Miles Davis group. So that generation of musicians, they're very, very important. Miles Davis is very important. And I think the reason is because he gave them a platform. He gave them a platform to be able to get the deals and the profile, to do something very experimental, and the audience was ready for it. We will never see that again, possibly, but I think this is why these musicians that we've been talking about in this video are the essential jazz rock fusion musicians. And I think however much time goes on, musicians will be always looking to that generation for inspiration, and I think that's really what this channel is about, isn't it? So if you want more inspiration like this, more discussion of real music, this is what we're talking about. If you're interested in real music, real musicians, you know, then like, subscribe, and I will see you on the next video. Thank you very much.